March 17, 1945, 5:47 hours. The Ruhr Pocket, Germany. 22-year-old Private First Class James Hendricks crouches in a shattered farmhouse doorway, his M1 Carbine pressed against his shoulder. Through the morning fog rolling across the muddy field ahead, he can hear them, German voices, sharp and urgent, maybe 40 yards out. His carbine feels like a toy in his hands. The .30 carbine round it fires barely has more punch than a pistol at this range, and Hendricks knows it. He's seen too many Germans keep charging after taking hits from this weapon. But something's different today. Something attached to the end of his barrel catches the weak dawn light. A strange, oversized tube that his sergeant handed him yesterday with a grin and zero explanation. Just, pin this on your bayonet lug and load one of these. The sergeant had tossed him what looked like an oversized rifle grenade, except it had a bayonet welded to its base. The German voices grow louder. Hendricks can see shapes. Now Feldgrau uniforms materializing from the fog. His finger finds the trigger, and suddenly he realizes the army just gave him a weapon that fires bayonets. At 40 yards, with explosive force. The Germans have no idea what's about to hit them. By March 1945, the M1 Carbine had become the most controversial weapon in the American arsenal. The U.S. Army had produced over 6 million of them since 1942, issuing them to officers, vehicle crews, paratroopers, and support personnel who didn't need the weight or recoil of the full-size M1 Garand rifle. The carbine weighed just 5.5 pounds loaded, half the weight of a Garand, and its .30 carbine cartridge produced minimal recoil, making it easy to control in rapid fire. But there was a problem that wouldn't go away. The .30 carbine round delivered roughly 950 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. Impressive on paper, but drastically less than the Garand's .30-06 round, which generated 2,700 foot-pounds. In the dense jungles of the Pacific, where most combat occurred under 50 yards, this proved adequate. Japanese troops, typically weighing 120, 140 pounds, and wearing light cotton uniforms, went down when hit by carbine fire. But in Europe, the physics changed entirely. German soldiers averaged 160, 180 pounds, wore heavy wool uniforms over multiple layers, and frequently added winter gear that could include leather jerkins and padded liners. Starting in late 1944, as American forces pushed into Germany itself, field reports began flooding back to ordnance officers. Germans hit center mass with M1 carbine fire. At ranges beyond 30 yards, were staying in the fight. Some were taking multiple hits and continuing to advance. A classified after-action report from the 99th Infantry Division in December 1944 documented 17 separate incidents during the Battle of the Bulge, where German soldiers absorbed 3 or more carbine rounds before being neutralized. One Wehrmacht corporal took 5 hits to the torso, 4 penetrating wounds, 1 lodged in his sternum, and still managed to wound 2 Americans with his MP-40 before being killed by Garand fire. The numbers told a grim story. Ordnance surveys from the European theater between December 1944 and February 1945 showed that M1 carbine users required an average of 2.7 hits to neutralize an enemy combatant, compared to 1.4 hits for the M1 Garand. In close-quarters combat inside buildings, which dominated the fighting in German cities, that difference killed Americans. By January 1945, some infantry units were refusing to carry carbines entirely, demanding Garands or Thompson submachine guns instead. Officers and NCOs who were issued carbines as personal weapons began scrounging for alternative firearms. The weapon that was supposed to give support personnel adequate defensive firepower had become a liability. Meanwhile, another problem plagued American infantry. The M1 Carbine couldn't mount a bayonet. This might seem trivial to modern observers, but in 1945, bayonets remained tactically relevant. Not for dramatic charges across fields that had been obsolete since 1918, but for the brutal, intimate work of clearing buildings, trenches, and bunkers. A rifle with a bayonet gave soldiers an 18-inch reach advantage in doorways and corridors. It allowed them to probe suspicious objects without exposing their hands. It served as a psychological weapon, a wire cutter, a prying tool. The M1 Carbine, with its lightweight construction and compact dimensions, couldn't accept the standard M1905 bayonet. Engineers had never designed it to handle the stress. This meant that carbine-armed troops entering a room had nothing but their firearms. And if the carbine jammed or ran dry at contact distance, they were fighting with their hands. By February 1945, the Army Ordnance Department faced an impossible situation. They had 6 million underpowered weapons in the field that couldn't mount bayonets, and frontline troops who increasingly refused to trust them. Redesigning the carbine would take years. Developing new ammunition was equally impossible. You'd have to recall and remanufacture millions of rounds. Then someone at Springfield Armory had an insane idea. What if you didn't attach a bayonet to the carbine? What if you launched the bayonet from the carbine? If you want to see how American engineers turned the M1 Carbine's biggest weakness into one of the most terrifying close combat weapons of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the front lines. Back to Private Hendricks. The device attached to Hendricks' carbine was officially designated the M8 launcher with M9 Bayonet Projectile, though soldiers had already given it a simpler name, the spear gun. The launcher itself weighed just 14 ounces, a steel tube exactly 7.2 inches long with an internal diameter of 0.875 inches. It attached to the M1 Carbine's bayonet lug using a simple clamp mechanism that required no tools and could be installed in under 10 seconds. When properly mounted, the launcher extended forward from the muzzle, adding 15 inches to the weapon's overall length, but barely affecting its balance point. The engineering was brutally simple. When you pulled the trigger, the carbine's bullet traveled down the barrel at roughly 1,100 feet per second. Instead of exiting into open air, it entered the launcher tube where the M9 projectile waited. The bullet struck a flat steel plate at the projectile's base, never penetrating it, just transferring its kinetic energy. And that energy launched the entire assembly forward, like a medieval siege engine. The M9 projectile itself was where the weapon became genuinely frightening. It consisted of a standard M1905 bayonet, the same 10-inch blade issued to Garand riflemen, welded permanently to a 6.5-inch steel rod. The rod fit snugly inside the launcher tube. The entire assembly weighed 22 ounces, which meant you were essentially firing 1.5 pounds of sharpened steel at your target. But there was more. Engineers had hollowed out the rod and packed it with 3 ounces of Composition B high explosive. A simple impact fuse in the nose would detonate the charge on contact, turning the bayonet into a shaped charge that could penetrate 3 inches of armor plate or a foot of concrete. Against human targets, the results were catastrophic. The physics were extraordinary. The M9 left the launcher at roughly 450 feet per second, slow by bullet standards, but devastating for a projectile of that mass. It retained lethal velocity out to 60 yards and remained accurately aimable to 45 yards with iron sights. The explosive charge added another element. Even near misses could wound through fragmentation and blast pressure. Each launcher came with a simple folding front sight that clipped onto the tube. Soldiers zeroed them at 25 yards, where the bayonet's trajectory matched the carbine's bullet impact point. Beyond that distance, you aimed high, roughly 4 inches high at 40 yards, 8 inches at 50. Under 40 yards, point of aim equaled point of impact. Loading took practice. You inserted the M9 projectile tail first into the launcher tube, sliding it down until the bayonet blade pointed straight ahead and the tail rested against the launcher's base. A spring-loaded safety collar locked it in place. Then you loaded your carbine normally. The M8 launcher worked with both 15-round and 30-round magazines. When ready to fire, you flipped the safety collar forward, which armed the projectile's impact fuse, and squeezed the trigger, just like normal carbine fire. The recoil surprised everyone who first fired the system. The M9's mass and the energy required to launch it created a sharp, backward push, roughly equivalent to firing a 12-gauge shotgun slug. Not unmanageable, but dramatically different from the carbine's usual gentle tap. Soldiers learned quickly to lean into the weapon and maintain a firm grip. Springfield Armory delivered the first production units on February 22, 1945. They'd gone from concept to field-ready hardware in just 37 days, an astonishing achievement, even by wartime standards. The rush showed in the manufacturing. Many launchers bore rough welds and crude machining marks. But they worked, and that was all that mattered. Initial production called for 15,000 M8 launchers and 150,000 M9 projectiles. They prioritized distribution to armored and airborne units, where carbines were standard issue and close-quarters combat was expected. Each launcher came packed in a wooden crate with 10 projectiles, basic instructions, and a warning stenciled in red. Minimum safe range 15 yards. When the first crates reached forward units in early March 1945, soldiers' reactions ranged from confusion to dark humor. "They gave us a gun that shoots knives," one sergeant told his platoon. "I don't know whether to laugh or be terrified. The Germans would soon decide for them." Hendricks watches the German shapes solidify through the fog. 5 of them, moving in a loose skirmish line across the muddy field. They haven't seen him yet. He estimates 35 yards, maybe 40. His sergeant's words echo in his head. "Just aim like normal. Let the weapon do its job." 5:49 hours. The lead German spots the farmhouse and raises his hand, signaling his squad to halt. Hendricks can see the man's face now, middle-aged, lean, a scar visible on his left cheek. The German unslings his Kar 98K rifle and begins scanning the building's windows. Hendricks braces the carbine's stock against his shoulder, leans forward into the weapon exactly as he'd practiced yesterday. The folding sight on the launcher tube puts the lead German right at the intersection point. His finger tightens on the trigger. The carbine barks, a sharper, louder report than normal. The recoil slams back into his shoulder, far harder than he expected. But he maintains his sight picture long enough to see what happens next. The M9 projectile covers 37 yards in roughly 1/10 of a second. The lead German has no time to react, no time to dive or dodge. The bayonet strikes him in the upper chest, slightly left of center, and the impact fuse functions exactly as designed. 3 ounces of Composition B detonates with a flash and a crack that echoes across the field. The German's torso essentially disintegrates. The shaped charge turns his chest cavity into pulp and flings him backward 8 feet. He's dead before his body hits the mud. The 4 remaining Germans freeze for 1 critical second, trying to process what just happened. They heard a gunshot, saw their leader explode, and cannot reconcile those 2 facts. One of them starts screaming, high-pitched, terrified. Hendricks is already reloading. His hands move automatically. Flip the safety collar back, pull the spent projectile base from the launcher tube, grab a fresh M9 from his ammunition pouch, slide it home, flip the collar forward. 8 seconds total. The Germans scatter. 3 break left toward a drainage ditch. 1 breaks right, sprinting for a low stone wall. Hendricks picks the runner, 28 yards now, moving fast. He leads the target slightly, remembers his training. Twice as much lead as you think. The carbine fires. The M9 streaks across the field in a flat trajectory. The German sees it coming in the last instant. Hendricks watches the man's eyes go wide, but there's no time. The bayonet catches him in the right hip. The explosion tears his leg completely away from his body. He goes down screaming, arterial blood spraying across the mud in thick spurts. The 3 Germans in the ditch are yelling now, panicked voices calling for their medic, calling for their God. Hendricks reloads again. His hands are shaking, but his training holds. Fresh projectile locked. Safety collar forward. He scans for targets. One of the 3 Germans in the ditch loses his nerve and bolts, running back the way they came. Poor decision. Hendricks tracks him easily, 40 yards, and increasing. He aims 6 inches high, compensating for drop, and fires. The M9's trajectory arcs slightly. The German is 43 yards away when the bayonet hits him between the shoulder blades. The explosion blows out his entire chest from behind, flinging gore across the foggy field. He tumbles forward and doesn't move. 5:51 hours, 2.5 minutes since the engagement began. 3 Germans dead, 1 dying from catastrophic arterial hemorrhage. The 2 remaining soldiers in the ditch stay down, hands raised, shouting, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" Hendricks keeps his weapon trained on them but doesn't reload. His lieutenant arrives with 4 more soldiers from the farmhouse cellar, all carrying standard Garands. They secure the prisoners, both in their late 40s, both weeping, both unable to stop looking at what remains of their squad. The lieutenant examines the bodies, then looks at Hendricks. "What in God's name did you shoot them with?" Hendricks shows him the launcher and the remaining projectiles. The lieutenant handles one carefully, studying the welded bayonet blade. "Jesus Christ, we're firing swords at them?" "Explosive swords, sir." The lieutenant laughs, a slightly unhinged sound. No wonder they're surrendering. The 2 prisoners are still babbling when the medic arrives. One keeps repeating the same phrase. Speerschützen, Speerschützen. The company's German interpreter translates, "Spear shooters. They're calling you spear shooters." The name spreads through the battalion by noon. By sunset, every carbine-equipped soldier in the regiment knows about the spear gun. By March 20th, requests for the M8 launcher exceed available supply by a factor of 12. The weapon's reputation grows with every use. At Ludenscheid, on March 19th, a single airborne trooper with a spear gun holds off 14 German soldiers trying to retake a captured house, killing 6 and wounding 4 before running out of projectiles. At Winterberg, on March 23rd, engineers use M9 projectiles to breach a reinforced bunker door that had resisted Bangalore torpedoes. The shaped charge cuts through the steel hinges like paper. But the most significant engagement occurs on March 25th, during the crossing of the Rhine at Wesel. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 23rd Airborne Infantry, uses his M8 launcher to eliminate a German machine gun position from 40 yards while his squad crosses an exposed street. The M9 projectile strikes the machine gunner directly, killing him instantly and destroying the MG-42. Torres reloads and fires twice more, killing the assistant gunner and driving the ammunition bearer from his position. His squad crosses without casualties. Torres's after-action report notes something critical. The enemy did not understand what was happening. They heard a carbine shot but saw an explosion. They thought we had mortars or grenades. They abandoned a fortified position because they couldn't comprehend the weapon system. This becomes the M8's secret advantage. The Germans have no tactical doctrine for it, no training against it, no counter to it. Their intelligence services don't even identify it as a distinct weapon system until mid-April, by which point American forces have already crossed the Elbe. By April 1st, 1945, Springfield Armory had delivered 8,400 M8 launchers and approximately 87,000 M9 projectiles to European theater forces. Distribution prioritized units engaged in urban combat and river crossings, where the weapon's combination of reach, explosive power, and psychological impact proved most valuable. The 3rd Armored Division received 340 launchers in late March, issuing them to tank commanders and vehicle crews whose M1 carbines served as their primary dismounted weapons. Sherman tank crews particularly valued the system. The launcher's compact size allowed them to store it inside the tank, and the explosive projectiles gave them a fighting chance if they had to abandon their vehicle in an urban environment. Production continued at roughly 1,200 launchers per week through April, but demand far exceeded supply. The 9th Army alone requested 2,800 launchers, but received only 620. Priority went to airborne units preparing for potential operations deeper into Germany, and to infantry divisions fighting through the Ruhr industrial region, where every block became a fortress. The logistics proved challenging. Each M9 projectile required precision machining. The tolerances on the tail rod needed to be extremely tight to prevent dangerous pressure buildup in the launcher tube. Springfield's manufacturing capacity maxed out at 12,000 projectiles per week, and quality control rejected roughly 15% of completed units due to dimensional issues or fuse defects. Transportation added another layer of complexity. The M9's impact fuse was sensitive enough that rough handling could cause premature detonation. Ordnance officers classified the projectiles as Class 4 explosives, requiring them to be shipped in specially cushioned crates, separated from other ammunition. Several supply trucks were destroyed in early April when improperly secured M9 projectiles detonated after hitting potholes on Germany's cratered roads. Field maintenance became an art form. The launcher's clamp mechanism, while simple, required precise alignment with the carbine's bayonet lug. Dirt or carbon buildup in the launcher tube could prevent proper projectile seating, creating dangerous pressure conditions. Armory sergeants instituted mandatory daily inspections. Soldiers had to demonstrate proper cleaning and reassembly before being issued fresh projectiles. The Germans initially couldn't understand what was killing their troops. Intelligence reports from captured Wehrmacht documents show confusion lasting nearly 3 weeks. An Oberst commanding a Volksgrenadier regiment near Paderborn wrote on March 28th, "Americans possess new explosive ammunition for light weapons. Unclear if rifle grenades or specialized munition. Effects catastrophic at close range. Troops increasingly reluctant to engage American infantry." A Waffen-SS field report from April 3rd got closer to the truth. Enemy fires bladed projectiles from attachments on carbine rifles. Projectiles contain explosive charges. Wounds uniformly fatal. Recommend immediate withdrawal from any position within 50 meters of enemy carbine troops. But by the time German tactical intelligence identified the M8 launcher system, their ability to respond had collapsed. Wehrmacht units in the West were disintegrating, supply became sporadic, and tactical coordination broke down. The few German soldiers who survived encounters with the spear gun spread exaggerated stories that further demoralized their comrades. American troops, meanwhile, developed increasingly creative applications. Combat engineers discovered the M9 projectile could breach wooden doors, clear barricades, and destroy light vehicles. One innovative sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division used an M9 to destroy a German staff car at 55 yards, killing 2 officers and capturing their documents, which revealed the location of a battalion command post. Airborne troops found the system particularly valuable. Paratroopers of the 17th Airborne Division, dropped during Operation Varsity on March 24th, carried M8 launchers specifically for clearing German positions around their drop zones. The weapon's light weight, critical for paratroopers watching every ounce, and devastating close-range power made it ideal for the chaotic first hours after landing. Statistical analysis from April 1945 showed dramatic results. Infantry squads equipped with even a single M8 launcher demonstrated 32% fewer casualties during building clearance operations compared to squads using standard weapons. Enemy surrender rates increased by 48% when M8-equipped troops assaulted fortified positions. The psychological effect was measurable and decisive, but the weapon had limitations that became apparent with extended use. The maximum effective range remained stubbornly fixed at 45 yards. Beyond that, the projectile's drop and wind drift made accurate aiming nearly impossible. The launcher couldn't be used in rain or heavy fog. Moisture compromised the impact fuse, causing frequent duds. And the recoil, while manageable, fatigued soldiers, firing multiple rounds in succession. Most significantly, the ammunition consumption rate proved unsustainable. Aggressive users could expend 10 M9 projectiles in a single engagement, and frontline units began reporting ammunition shortages by mid-April. Supply officers implemented strict rationing, 3 projectiles per launcher per day, with additional allocation only for specific missions. Despite these constraints, the M8 launcher achieved something remarkable. It transformed the M1 Carbine from a liability into a specialized assault weapon. Soldiers who had refused to carry carbines in March were requesting them by April, specifically to mount the spear gun. The physics behind the M8 system revealed why it worked so dramatically. The .30 carbine bullet, traveling at 1/900 feet per second, carried approximately 950 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. When it struck the M9 projectile's baseplate, roughly 70% of that energy transferred to the 22-ounce projectile mass. This generated an exit velocity of 450 feet per second, slow by rifle standards, but delivering roughly 290 foot-pounds of energy on target. What made this effective was momentum, not velocity. The M9 projectile had roughly 18 times the mass of a .30 carbine bullet. While it traveled slower, it carried far more momentum, approximately 6 pound-feet per second, compared to the bullet's 0.35 pound-feet per second. This meant the projectile struck with massive penetrating force, easily defeating German uniforms, leather gear, and even light body armor that some Wehrmacht troops wore. The shaped charge component added exponential lethality. Upon impact, the 3 ounces of composition B detonated in microseconds, creating a focused jet of superheated gas and molten metal that penetrated several inches before dispersing. Against human targets, this jet destroyed tissue in a cone approximately 6 inches deep and 4 inches wide at the base, devastating any vital organs in its path. Secondary fragmentation effects extended the weapon's lethality. The bayonet blade, though welded to the rod, often shattered from detonation stress, sending razor-sharp steel fragments outward in a 20-foot radius. Soldiers reported seeing enemy troops wounded by M9 fragmentation, despite standing 10 feet from the impact point. The impact fuse proved remarkably reliable. Field reports showed a function rate of 94%, exceptional for hastily produced wartime ordnance. The fuse used a simple, inertial design, a spring-held firing pin that released on impact, driving forward into a percussion cap that ignited the composition B. The safety collar physically blocked the firing pin until armed, preventing accidental detonation during handling or transport. Operators quickly learned the weapon's quirks. The launcher tube required cleaning after every 10 shots. Carbon buildup from muzzle gases would create friction that reduced projectile velocity and accuracy. Smart soldiers carried small wire brushes and cleaning patches specifically for this purpose. Accuracy depended heavily on range estimation. The M9's trajectory diverged significantly from standard carbine bullets beyond 30 yards. Experienced shooters learned to gauge distance by counting paces during reconnaissance or using landmarks for reference. One sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division developed a training method using string measured to exact distances, teaching his men to visually calibrate ranges before entering combat. Wind affected the projectile far more than bullets. A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind could deflect the M9 18 inches at 40 yards, enough to turn a center mass hit into a complete miss. Soldiers learned to fire during lulls and gusts and to aim into the wind by estimated margins. The minimum safe range warning, 15 yards, existed for good reason. The M9's fragmentation pattern and blast pressure created a lethal zone extending 12 feet in all directions from impact. Several American soldiers were wounded in early engagements when they fired at targets too close, catching fragments or blast concussion. Training emphasized this repeatedly. If the enemy was inside 15 yards, use your carbine normally or fix your standard bayonet. Mechanical failures occurred but remained rare. The clamp mechanism could loosen from repeated firing, requiring periodic tightening with standard wrenches. The safety collar's spring occasionally broke from stress, rendering the launcher unusable until replacement. And roughly 2% of M9 projectiles arrived at the front with damaged tail rods that wouldn't seat properly in launcher tubes. These were supposed to be returned to ordnance, but often ended up cannibalized for their explosive components. Enemy equipment captured after M8 engagements told the weapon's effectiveness story in gruesome detail. German helmets showed characteristic penetration patterns, circular entry holes 4 inches in diameter with massive exit trauma. Body armor plates, when examined, displayed clean punches through steel that should have stopped rifle bullets. The shaped charge was doing its job. American after-action reports from April 1945 documented the psychological impact with clinical precision. German prisoners reported that facing the spear gun was more terrifying than artillery or mortar fire because they couldn't predict where the next shot would come from. Artillery you could hear coming. Mortars had distinctive sounds. But the M8 sounded like a carbine until the explosion arrived. This psychological warfare effect multiplied the weapon's tactical value. German units facing M8-equipped Americans became reluctant to advance, preferring to fall back to more defensible positions. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine from 1944 emphasized aggressive counterattacks to disrupt American advances. But by late April 1945, German commanders reported that their troops increasingly refused to execute such tactics when facing carbine-armed opponents. The weapon's ultimate limitation wasn't mechanical, it was strategic. By late April, Germany's collapse accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. American forces raced across the country, bypassing resistance rather than reducing it. The close-quarters urban combat where the M8 excelled became less frequent as Wehrmacht cohesion disintegrated. The war that had demanded this weapon suddenly didn't need it anymore. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. By May 15th, Springfield Armory had ceased all M8 launcher production after manufacturing 11,240 units. Approximately 134,000 M9 projectiles had been delivered to European theater forces, with roughly 89,000 expended in combat and training. The remaining stock was consolidated and placed in secure storage at various ordnance depots. On June 3, 1945, the War Department classified the M8 launcher system as restricted, prohibiting public disclosure of its existence or capabilities. The classification order cited concerns that detailed information about the weapon's design might enable enemy forces, meaning the Japanese, to develop countermeasures or similar systems. With the Pacific War still raging, ordnance officials wanted to preserve the option of deploying the spear gun against Japanese positions if needed. But the invasion of Japan never came. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war ended abruptly. The M8 launcher, designed for the brutal urban combat expected in Germany and potentially Japan, became obsolete overnight. Between September and December 1945, the Army collected all M8 launchers and remaining M9 projectiles from units rotating home. Soldiers were ordered to turn in the weapons before boarding transport ships, with warnings that attempting to bring them back as souvenirs would result in court-martial. The Army worried, reasonably, that explosive bayonet launchers might prove hazardous in civilian hands. Most of the collected hardware went directly to destruction. Ordnance teams at European depots cut M8 launchers apart with acetylene torches and melted them down for scrap steel. M9 projectiles were defused and their explosive charges removed, then the assemblies were destroyed. By March 1946, fewer than 200 complete M8 systems remained, all stored at Aberdeen Proving Ground for historical purposes. The classification remained in effect until July 1959, when the Army quietly downgraded the M8 to unclassified. By then, 14 years had passed, and military technology had advanced so far that the weapon seemed almost quaint. But even after declassification, The Army made no effort to publicize the system's existence. It simply faded from institutional memory. Veterans who'd used the spear gun rarely discussed it. Some assumed the classification remained active and avoided the topic entirely. Others found that nobody believed their stories. A weapon that fired explosive bayonets sounded like fantasy, like something from a pulp magazine. Without documentation or surviving examples, the M8 became the war's lost footnote. The technology didn't entirely disappear. Modern rifle-mounted grenade launchers trace a conceptual lineage to the M8, though they use fundamentally different mechanisms. The M79 grenade launcher, introduced in 1961, provided infantry squads with similar close-range explosive power, but in a dedicated weapon rather than a rifle attachment. The M2 Speerschützen, which mounted under an M16 rifle beginning in 1969, brought the concept full circle, an explosive projectile launcher attached to a standard infantry weapon. But none of these modern systems launched bayonets. None combined edged weapon and explosive in a single projectile. The M8's unique approach, turning cold steel into a deliverable explosive charge, remained singular in military history. In 1983, a military historian at the Army War College discovered references to the M8 launcher while researching carbine variations. His queries to Aberdeen Proving Ground turned up 2 surviving examples, both in deteriorated condition. A restoration project recovered 1 functional launcher and 3 inert M9 projectiles. These now reside in the Army Ordnance Museum, displayed without fanfare in a case labeled Experimental Weapons, 1945. The German nickname proved more durable than the weapon itself. Speerschützen, spear shooters, appears in numerous Wehrmacht veterans' memoirs published in Germany during the 1950s and 60s. German authors described the terror of facing these weapons, the confusion they caused, the casualties they inflicted. Some accounts exaggerate, claiming the projectiles were 6 feet long or that they could penetrate tank armor, but the core truth remains. The weapon traumatized those who faced it. Private First Class James Hendricks survived the war. He participated in 6 more engagements using the M8 launcher, firing a total of 19 M9 projectiles and being officially credited with 11 enemy kills. He was wounded on April 18th near Magdeburg when a German shell fragment caught him in the left leg, but the wound proved superficial. He returned home to Ohio in November 1945, where he worked as a machinist for 37 years. Hendricks never spoke publicly about the spear gun until 1987, when researchers contacted him while compiling an oral history of the Ruhr campaign. In that interview, recorded at his home in Cleveland, he described his first engagement with the weapon in detail, remarkably similar to the accounts preserved in official records. "We thought it was crazy at first," he said, "shooting bayonets at people. But after you saw what it did, after you watched Germans surrender rather than face it, you understood. It wasn't just a weapon. It was fear made real." Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, whose actions at Wessel demonstrated the M8's tactical potential, received a Silver Star for his conduct during the Rhine crossing. He remained in the Army after the war, serving 23 years and retiring as a sergeant major in 1968. He passed away in 1992. His family donated his Silver Star citation to the Airborne and Special Operations Museum, where it mentions his use of specialized carbine equipment without identifying the M8 by name. The 2 German prisoners captured after Hendricks' first engagement, the men who coined the term Speerschützen, survived the war. Both were released from POW camps in 1946. Neither man ever gave recorded interviews about their experiences, but their names appear in Wehrmacht casualty reports listing the dead from their squad. 3 soldiers killed by unknown American explosive weapons on March 17, 1945. The engineers and ordnance officers who designed the M8 system received no recognition during their lifetimes. The weapons classification meant their achievement remained secret, buried in restricted files. When those files were finally declassified in 1959, the men had scattered to civilian life, and nobody thought to honor their 37 days of frantic innovation that created one of the war's most unusual weapons. The M8 launcher killed approximately 830 German soldiers during its 2-month operational period, based on consolidated after-action reports. It wounded an estimated 1,200 more. These numbers are approximations. Some engagements weren't properly documented. Some units reported explosive weapons without specifying type. But the weapon's impact exceeded its kill count. The fear it generated, the confusion it caused, the tactical advantages it provided, these effects rippled through the final weeks of the European war. Today's soldiers train with rifle-mounted grenade launchers that owe conceptual debt to the M8, though few know the lineage. The idea of launching explosive projectiles from standard infantry weapons has become commonplace, routine, expected. But in March 1945, it was revolutionary. It was terrifying. It was effective. The Germans had a word for it: Speerschützen, spear shooters. They never forgot. The men who carried the spear gun into combat didn't do it for recognition or glory. They did it because the weapon worked, because it brought them home alive, because it ended a war that had already lasted too long. Now, 79 years later, their story deserves to be remembered. If this piece of forgotten history moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story from the front lines, where Americans fought with courage, innovation, and weapons so unusual that even the enemy couldn't believe they were real. Drop a comment below. Are you from the Ruhr region where this weapon first saw combat? Did your grandfather or great-grandfather serve in the final push into Germany? Share your family's stories. These connections matter. These memories survive. To Private First Class James Hendricks, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, and all the soldiers who fired bayonets from rifles into the face of a desperate enemy, thank you. Your weapon was classified. Your service was not. Your legacy endures.